New Orleans is a school system that by 2004, so the year before Hurricane Katrina hits, is among the worst in the country. It's a coin flip whether your kid graduates from a high school in New Orleans in 2004. The school district was so corrupt that the commissioner, the superintendent of the schools wanted to audit his own school district, but the school board blocked him because they knew how much corruption he would find. The FBI set up an office in the school district because it was so corrupt, and they started indicting members. That's how corrupt it was. They wanted to set up their own office there because they knew it would be
Crazy.
more efficient. So that's Katrina on the eve. That's New Orleans on the eve of Katrina. Katrina hits, wipes out the entire school system, basically destroys all the buildings. And because the district was already insolvent essentially before Katrina, they had no money to pay their teachers. They couldn't even create a buffer. So they lay off all their teachers, about 7,000 educators en masse. There is no school system pretty much that year after Katrina. And there was a little known state law that was passed a few years before that allowed the state to take over low performing schools. And lo and behold, basically all of New Orleans was low performing by their definitions. And they also started to finagle with the definitions so that they could take over all the schools. Long story short, they take over all the schools. They basically charter almost all of them. And I'm sure people are familiar with charters, but in New Orleans and in most states, charters are nonprofit institutions like mine that run schools independent of school districts and usually have to meet, depending on the state, a series of benchmarks to succeed. In Louisiana, they're fairly stringent, and you have to, you know, achieve good test scores and graduation rates, and in some cases, they throw in parent satisfaction and attrition and attendance, like enrollment numbers. And what happened was they wound up chartering a bunch. Basically, they're about 80% charter, and they had an influx of outside talent, Teach for America, yada yada yada, outsiders, and insiders, but definitely more outsiders than ever before. And then they have ruthless accountability, so that the the way they governed schools was, hey, you get a couple years, but if you're slipping, we're going to close you,
Hmm.
and we're going to consolidate people, we're going to whatever. And that's about what the system looks like for 10 years. And they start achieving incredible results. And I write about this and we talk about it, like awesome results. But they also started to see some cracks in the system. Schools were gaming, and charters will do this. And this is why, like what I was saying, what my conversation would be to my conservative friends about ESAs and vouchers. If you don't create mechanisms in the system, schools will game it in a way that there are tough kids and they don't take those tough kids, whether they have severe special needs
Right.
or emotional disturbances. And I just think that kids need a place to go to school. Like, you cannot have a system where nobody will take those kids. And that what was happening in New Orleans 10 years in. So they're achieving all these great results, but there are these problems. Their parents are confused because there's not one application system. So schools are throwing up barriers and trying to game it so they can get the right kids. Kids with special needs are having a hard time finding a good education. Transportation is a problem, all that. So 10 years in, they start solving all these problems, right? They create a one application system. They create like one of the most generous weighted funding formulas. So kids with special needs are getting a ton of funding. They created a common expulsion system so schools couldn't like monkey around with expulsions to kick out kids that shouldn't be kicked out. And so that's been the last 10 years of New Orleans. And they also have like gotten better at training teachers from New Orleans so that there was this big problem of legitimacy within the system where like politically the schools were explosive because they were being run by a lot of like white outsiders, which like for people who are like who gives a shit about identity politics, like which is generally my frame of mind, in that environment, it was not tenable politically. Like the
Right.
schools were not politically viable in an environment where what was the black middle class, which was the teaching professions laid off overnight, and then they can't get jobs, and then they're getting resentful of this outside presence. So they started doing a better job of recruiting people locally. And what was cool is a lot of the people who came in, it was like a test, right? It's like the people who stayed, and they earned people's trust, and the people who left, uh, they left, so who cares? And then the other people in the neighborhood and stuff who got jobs, they all became one, and like now there's not these fights, there's not these wars anymore, and the results have been sustained and in some cases improved. And so you have dramatic increases, like something like 50 something percent graduation rate to 70 something percent.
Wow.
Um, there were something like two-thirds, and I could have this number wrong off the top of my head, but it's in my piece, the correct number. Something like two-thirds of schools were rated failing by the state pre-Katrina, zero now. Something like 28% increase in college going rates. parent increases the parent satisfaction numbers, and I go through all these things, and then my eye test, right? I talk about the school Carver, which I'd seen many times in its trajectory, was a very troubled school in 2004. Like sexual assaults happening in the school. The district had to create a whole task force about it. It had a 50% graduation rate. Now, is the highest student growth in the city. It has incredible college. I ran into a kid in the hallways who's going to Princeton. That it met my eye test. It was a beautiful, orderly school that was happy. Had state championship basketball teams, award-winning marching band, and that's changed. But as I wrote about in this piece that you're talking about, the Atlantic wrote two articles about Carver 10 years ago because there were fights going on about Carver. So it
Right.
was a juicy story. So they're like, oh, the community is fighting with the charter people. And it was a beautiful story from their perspective. It's like juicy, right? To my knowledge, has never written about it since. And the real story is today. The real story is
Right.
like, wow, those people got together, they solved their problem, and
Hmm.
now they've created this beautiful school that is in the ninth ward of New Orleans, which is like one
Hmm.
of the toughest places to run a public school, and it's thriving.
That's amazing.
That's a story.